A Missouri courtroom, May 2025. Three men in orange jumpsuits stand before a federal judge, their hands shackled, their futures sealed. These aren't ordinary criminals facing ordinary charges. These are members of one of America's most feared outlaw motorcycle clubs, the Pagans MC. And the crimes they're confessing to? Calculated acts of violence that would make even hardened detectives pause. Christopher McGowen steps forward first, his voice steady, almost mechanical, as he admits to hunting rival bikers with axes and loaded firearms. Behind him, Arthur straight-edge Reynolds III waits his turn, knowing he's about to confess to shooting a man 7 times. Not in passion, not in self-defense, but because a rival club member had the audacity to exist in the wrong territory at the wrong time. This wasn't a moment of rage. This wasn't a bar fight gone wrong. This was something far more sinister. A systematic campaign of terror, orchestrated by men who turned violence into an art form. They had a name for their strategy: smash on sight. The rules were simple. The execution was brutal. But how does a group of motorcycle enthusiasts transform into hunters stalking human prey across state lines? What drives men to celebrate violence like a promotion at work? And why did federal investigators call this one of the most organized campaigns of biker brutality they'd ever encountered? The answers lie in a world where loyalty is measured in blood, where patches are earned through pain, and where the roar of engines masks the screams of victims. This is the story of how the Pagans Motorcycle Club turned America's highways into hunting grounds. Brothers in blood. The Pagans Motorcycle Club didn't start as monsters. Founded in the late 1950s along the East Coast, they began like countless other motorcycle clubs, riders seeking brotherhood, freedom, and the open road. But somewhere between then and now, something twisted in their DNA. What started as weekend rides evolved into something the FBI would later classify as one of America's most dangerous criminal organizations. Unlike your neighborhood riding club, the Pagans operate with military precision. There's a chain of command, strict protocols, and consequences for disobedience that extend far beyond losing your membership card. Members don't just ride together. They live by a code that demands absolute loyalty, even when that loyalty requires breaking bones or pulling triggers. The club's expansion across multiple states wasn't accidental. Territory means power in the outlaw biker world. Control drug routes, influence weapons sales, intimidate competitors. The Pagans understood this better than most, and they weren't content to share the road with anyone who challenged their dominance. In Missouri, their arrival sent ripples through the established biker community. Rival clubs like the Sons of Silence and Border Saints suddenly found themselves facing an organization that didn't believe in coexistence. The Pagans' methodology was simple: submit or suffer. There was no middle ground, no negotiation, no peaceful resolution. What made them particularly dangerous was their structure. This wasn't a loose collection of rebels. It was a business model built on fear. Some members handled logistics, others gathered intelligence. A select few specialized in enforcement. When the club decided someone needed to be taught a lesson, they didn't rely on chance encounters or random violence. They planned, they prepared, and they executed with chilling efficiency. The phrase "smash on sight" became more than slang. It was policy. Spot a rival member wearing the wrong colors? Action was expected. Questions weren't asked. Hesitation wasn't tolerated. The club had weaponized loyalty, turning brotherhood into a hunting license. Federal investigators watching the Pagans' expansion noticed patterns that set them apart from typical criminal organizations. These weren't crimes of opportunity or passion. They were tactical operations designed to eliminate competition and establish dominance through overwhelming force. The Pagans had weaponized their motorcycles, turning Sunday rides into reconnaissance missions and club gatherings into war councils. By 2022, the writing was on the wall. Violence was escalating. Rival club members were disappearing or ending up in emergency rooms. Local law enforcement was overwhelmed. The Pagans had created a reign of terror that stretched across state lines, and they showed no signs of slowing down. The net closes. August 2024 marked the beginning of the end for the Pagans' Missouri operation. A federal grand jury had heard enough testimony, reviewed enough evidence, and witnessed enough bloodshed. 18 members and associates found themselves staring at indictments that read like a war crimes tribunal: conspiracy, racketeering, assault with deadly weapons, and charges that carried the possibility of life behind bars. The coordinated takedown wasn't a typical police raid. This was a multi-agency operation involving federal agents, local law enforcement, and tactical teams spread across multiple states. Within hours of the indictments being unsealed, doors were being kicked in, handcuffs were clicking shut, and the Pagans' carefully constructed empire was crumbling. What authorities discovered during their searches painted a picture of an organization prepared for warfare. Dozens of firearms ranging from handguns to high-powered rifles. Thousands of rounds of ammunition stored in strategic locations. Body armor that suggested they expected retaliation. Custom-built concealment compartments designed to hide weapons, drugs, and club materials from law enforcement. But the physical evidence was just the beginning. Investigators had been building their case for months, tracking communications, monitoring movements, and documenting a pattern of violence that stretched back years. They discovered that the recent attacks weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a systematic campaign to eliminate rival clubs through fear and brutality. One raid uncovered an illegal marijuana cultivation operation, confirming suspicions that the club's violence was protecting broader criminal enterprises. Another search revealed detailed records of club activities, including lists of rival members, territory maps, and communication networks that showed the scope of their organization. The evidence painted a picture of men who had turned violence into a profession, loaded weapons hidden in quick-access locations, vehicles modified with secret compartments, strategic stockpiles of ammunition placed near known rival territories. This wasn't a motorcycle club that occasionally got into fights. This was a military operation disguised as a brotherhood. What made the investigation particularly damning was the paper trail. Club records documented not just who participated in violent acts, but how those acts were planned, approved, and celebrated. The Pagans hadn't just committed crimes, they had created a corporate structure around committing crimes. When the dust settled from the raids, over a dozen members were in federal custody, facing charges that would likely keep them locked away for decades. But more importantly, investigators had exposed the inner workings of an organization that had turned brotherhood into a blood sport. Confessions of violence. The courtroom confessions that began in May 2025 lifted the curtain on a world most people never see, where violence isn't just accepted, it's celebrated. Christopher McGowen stood before the judge and calmly recounted acts that would haunt most people's nightmares. McGowen's first admission centered on May 30th, 2022, in Grain Valley, Missouri. A rival club member had made the mistake of stopping at a local business alone. For McGowen and his associates, this wasn't an unfortunate coincidence. It was an opportunity. They surrounded their target like wolves circling wounded prey. Fists flew first, followed by the sickening crack of an axe handle against flesh and bone. The victim's screams echoed through the parking lot as multiple attackers took turns delivering punishment for the crime of wearing the wrong patch. But McGowen's confession revealed something even more chilling. This wasn't his only planned attack. Just months later, he helped orchestrate an assault in Topeka, Kansas, where rival club members were holding an event. McGowen and his team didn't stumble into this confrontation. They traveled across state lines with premeditated intent, carrying axes and loaded firearms, ready to execute what they called a smash-on-sight mission. They identified their target outside a hotel, a lone rival member who had no idea death was watching him from across the parking lot. Weapons were distributed, plans were finalized. One member approached with an axe handle in hand, ready to strike. But something went wrong. Disagreements erupted within the attack team. Some questioned the timing, others the target selection. In a rare moment of dysfunction, they pulled back, leaving their intended victim alive, but completely unaware of how close he'd come to becoming another statistic. Arthur Straight Edge. Reynolds III's confession painted an even darker picture. September 17, 2022, in Blue Springs, Missouri. Reynolds and his crew weren't content to wait for random encounters. They went hunting. When they spotted a rival club member driving alone, they began a chase that would end in attempted murder. The pursuit wasn't brief. They followed their target for miles, coordinating their attack, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. When they finally forced the rival's vehicle off the road, Reynolds and his associates emerged from their cars like executioners. An axe handle was the first weapon deployed, but it wasn't enough. Someone drew a firearm and opened fire. 7 bullets found their mark: arms, legs, back. The victim absorbed round after round while trying desperately to escape. Somehow, impossibly, he survived. But the physical wounds were just part of the damage. The psychological scars, the knowledge that fellow human beings had tried to execute him for wearing the wrong colors, would last forever. Brandon Youngblood. Hodge's confession confirmed his role in the Grain Valley assault, admitting he wielded dangerous weapons during the coordinated attack. His participation might have seemed secondary, but the court recognized the truth. Without willing participants like Hodge, the club's violent campaigns couldn't succeed. Jeremiah pass out. Hahn's admissions tied together multiple incidents, confirming that these weren't isolated acts of violence, but part of a coordinated strategy. His detailed knowledge of planning sessions, weapon distribution, and target selection provided prosecutors with a roadmap of how the club transformed brotherhood into brutality. Each confession revealed the same disturbing pattern. Violence wasn't a last resort for these men. It was a first choice. They didn't attack in anger or desperation. They attacked because it was expected, because it was rewarded, and because they believed it was their right. Blood on the asphalt. The timeline of terror began on a seemingly ordinary day in Grain Valley, Missouri. May 30th, 2022, started like any other for the rival club member who stopped at a local business. He had no way of knowing that Pagans members had been watching, waiting, stalking their prey with the patience of predators. Christopher McGowen, Brandon Hodge, Jeremiah Hahn, and their associates moved with coordinated precision. This wasn't a chance encounter or a heated argument that spiraled out of control. They had spotted their target, identified him as a rival, and made a collective decision to deliver punishment. The attack was swift and merciless. Fists, boots, and the devastating impact of an axe handle turned a parking lot into a crime scene. The victim's hospitalization marked the beginning of a campaign that would escalate far beyond simple assault. For the Pagans, this attack served multiple purposes: eliminate a rival presence, send a message to other clubs, and prove their members' willingness to shed blood for the organization. 3 months later, the hunt moved to Kansas. September 3rd, 2022, found Pagans members traveling to Topeka with premeditated intent. A rival club was holding an event, gathering members in what they thought was neutral territory. But the Pagans didn't recognize neutrality, only opportunity. McGowen, Hahn, and their strike team arrived armed and ready. They brought an axe handle and a loaded firearm, tools chosen specifically for their capacity to inflict maximum damage. Their mission parameters were clear: locate any rival member, they called it catching a stray, and execute a smash-on-site assault that would leave no doubt about Pagans' dominance. Outside a Topeka hotel, they found their target. A rival club member stood alone, completely unaware that armed men were positioning themselves for attack. The weapon was passed between team members, final preparations were made, and one attacker began his approach. This should have been the moment when planning transformed into action, when another rival would learn the cost of defying Pagans' territory. Instead, something unprecedented happened: hesitation. Internal disagreements erupted among the attack team. Questions about timing, target selection, and execution strategy created fractures in their coordination. For perhaps the first and only time in this campaign, the Pagans pulled back without striking. Their intended victim walked away unharmed, never knowing how close he'd come to becoming another casualty in an undeclared war. But this moment of restraint wouldn't last. 2 weeks later, in Blue Springs, Missouri, the Pagans would prove that hesitation was an anomaly, not a pattern. September 17th, 2022, marked the most violent chapter in this timeline. A rival club member was driving through what he thought was safe territory when Pagans members began their pursuit. This wasn't a traffic dispute or road rage incident, It was a coordinated hunt with only one possible outcome. The chase stretched for miles, with multiple vehicles working together to corner their prey. When they finally forced the rival's car off the road, Reynolds and his team emerged with weapons drawn. An axe handle struck first, but the attackers weren't satisfied with simple battery. Someone drew a firearm and began shooting. 7 bullets found their target: arms, legs, back. Each shot was deliberate, aimed not just to wound, but to ensure the victim understood the price of challenging Pagan's authority. The fact that he survived was either extraordinary luck or a failure of execution. Either way, the message was delivered through blood and terror. The pattern didn't end with attempted murder. April 2023 brought another confrontation, when Jeremiah Hahn and an associate approached a rival member with familiar tools, an axe handle and criminal intent. This time, they added theft to their repertoire, taking a firearm from their victim's vehicle while delivering threats that left no doubt about future consequences. Each incident built upon the last, creating an escalating spiral of violence that stretched across state lines and multiple years. These weren't crimes of passion or moment of weakness. They were calculated acts designed to establish dominance through fear and maintain control through systematic brutality. Arsenal of intimidation. When federal agents executed search warrants on Pagan's properties, they uncovered evidence that transformed speculation into certainty. These weren't weekend warriors with a few hunting rifles. This was an organization equipped for sustained warfare against anyone who challenged their authority. Arthur Straight Edge, Reynolds III's residence, revealed the true scope of their preparation. 7 firearms of various calibers, boxes of ammunition stored with military precision, tactical body armor designed to stop bullets, not protect against motorcycle accidents, Pagan's patches, support gear, and paperwork that documented his deep involvement in club operations. The firearms weren't collector's items or sporting equipment. They were tools of intimidation, stored in quick-access locations throughout the residence. Loaded handguns near doorways, extra magazines attached to weapons. Everything positioned for rapid deployment when violence became necessary. But Reynolds wasn't unique. Additional raids across Missouri and Kansas revealed similar arsenals in multiple locations. High-powered rifles capable of engaging targets at long range. Handguns perfect for close-quarters intimidation. Ammunition stockpiles that suggested preparation for extended conflicts rather than isolated incidents. The custom concealment compartments discovered during searches demonstrated sophisticated criminal planning. Hidden spaces built into furniture, vehicles, and structures designed to hide weapons, drugs, and club materials from law enforcement detection. These weren't amateur modifications. They required planning, expertise, and significant investment in criminal infrastructure. Alongside the weapons, investigators found evidence of broader criminal enterprises. Illegal marijuana cultivation operations that explain the club's need for violent territorial protection. Drug distribution materials that connected violence to profit motives. Financial records that showed how intimidation supported broader criminal business models. The club's paperwork provided the most damning evidence of all. Member lists with contact information. Territory maps showing areas of influence and control. Communication records that documented planning sessions, target identification, and post-violence celebrations. The Pagans hadn't just committed crimes, they had documented their criminal enterprise with corporate thoroughness. What emerged from these searches was a picture of an organization that had weaponized brotherhood. They had transformed motorcycle enthusiasm into criminal enterprise, using violence as both a business tool and a recruitment incentive. The evidence showed systematic preparation for sustained conflict against anyone who challenged their dominance. Celebrating savagery. Perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Pagans' operation wasn't the violence itself. It was how that violence was celebrated within the organization. After members participated in brutal assaults, they weren't hidden away or disciplined for drawing law enforcement attention. They were rewarded. Following the September 2022 shooting, where a rival was chased down and shot 7 times, the attackers received special patches and verbal recognition from club leadership. These weren't quiet acknowledgments or private conversations. They were public celebrations of brutality worn as badges of honor. The patches served as permanent reminders that, within the Pagans' organization, violence wasn't just tolerated, it was currency. This reward system created a dangerous feedback loop that encouraged escalating brutality. Members understood that participation in violent acts could elevate their status within the club, earn them protection from higher-ranking members, and demonstrate their worthiness for increased responsibility. Violence became a path to advancement rather than a liability to be avoided. For younger or newer members, this culture created tremendous pressure to prove their loyalty through increasingly extreme acts. The club's expectations weren't subtle. Members who wanted respect had to be willing to shed blood for the organization. Those who hesitated or showed reluctance were viewed as weak links in the chain of brotherhood. The celebration of violence also made it impossible to separate individual criminal responsibility from organizational culture. While specific members carried out particular attacks, the mindset that enabled those attacks was club-wide. Members knew what was expected, understood the rewards for compliance, and faced consequences for failure to act when called upon. This systematic encouragement of violence explained why the club never attempted to distance itself from brutal assaults after they occurred. There were no public denials, no efforts to hide participants, no attempts to claim the attacks were unauthorized. Instead, the club embraced the violence as part of its identity, reinforcing the belief that brutality was simply part of the job description. The patch system also served as a permanent record of criminal activity. Each violent act, commemorated in fabric, became evidence that could be used against members in future prosecutions. The Pagans had essentially created a wearable confession system that documented their criminal enterprise for anyone willing to look closely enough. Justice's heavy hand. The guilty pleas that echoed through Missouri courtrooms in May 2025 triggered legal consequences that would reshape the defendants' lives permanently. Federal prosecutors had built cases that extended far beyond simple assault charges, weaving together racketeering, conspiracy, and weapons violations that carried sentences measured in decades rather than years. Christopher McGowen and Arthur Reynolds III faced the most severe potential punishments: life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. Their central roles in multiple violent incidents, combined with federal guidelines for racketeering and weapons charges, eliminated any hope of eventual freedom. The court viewed their actions not as isolated criminal acts, but as essential components of an ongoing criminal enterprise. Brandon Hodges' participation in the coordinated Grain Valley assault earned him potential sentences up to 20 years behind bars. While not charged with firearm use, his deliberate participation in planned violence demonstrated the same criminal intent that guided the organization's most serious offenders. The court recognized no meaningful distinction between pulling triggers and providing support that made trigger pulling possible. Jeremiah Hahn's involvement in both the Grain Valley assault and the attempted Topeka ambush placed him at the center of the club's violent campaign. His detailed knowledge of planning procedures, weapon distribution, and target selection made him invaluable to prosecutors building their case. But it also ensured his own lengthy imprisonment. Cooperation could reduce sentences, but it couldn't eliminate consequences for years of criminal activity. Mark Browell's admissions regarding firearm theft and intimidation added federal weapons charges to his criminal record. Even his relatively secondary role in the organization's violence earned him potential sentences that would consume years or decades of his remaining life. The court's message was clear: participation in criminal enterprises carried consequences regardless of individual rank or responsibility level. Federal judges approached these cases with recognition that individual sentences needed to reflect broader organizational dynamics. The defendants weren't just being punished for specific criminal acts, they were being held accountable for their roles in sustaining an organization that used violence as a business model. This perspective meant sentences would likely exceed typical ranges for similar individual crimes. The mandatory minimum sentences attached to federal firearms and racketeering charges eliminated judicial discretion in many areas. Regardless of personal circumstances, cooperation with authorities, or expressions of remorse, the defendants faced predetermined periods of imprisonment that reflected Congress's intent to severely punish organized criminal violence. For many defendants, the legal consequences represented effective life sentences, even when formal life imprisonment wasn't imposed. Men in their 40s and 50s facing 20- 30-year sentences would likely never experience meaningful freedom again. Their commitment to the Pagans organization had purchased them permanent residence in federal prison systems. Shadows still lurk. The courtroom confessions and lengthy sentences that emerge from this case represent just the visible portion of a much larger criminal iceberg. While several prominent Pagans members await decades behind bars, the organization that spawned their violence continues operating across multiple states with new leadership, updated tactics, and unchanged attitudes toward rivals who challenge their authority. Federal investigations into the club's broader operations remain active, with law enforcement agencies tracking connections between chapters, monitoring communications, and watching for signs of retaliation against witnesses or law enforcement personnel who contributed to recent prosecutions. The Pagans have demonstrated remarkable resilience in the face of previous law enforcement actions, suggesting their Missouri losses may prompt reorganization rather than surrender. Intelligence gathering continues to focus on identifying new leadership structures within the organization. When prominent members disappear into federal prison systems, remaining members don't simply disband. They adapt, promote from within, and continue operations with lessons learned from their predecessors' mistakes. The recent prosecutions may have eliminated specific individuals, but they haven't eliminated the culture that created those individuals. Investigators remain particularly concerned about potential retaliation against rivals who may have provided information leading to arrests and convictions. The Pagans' culture of violence doesn't typically tolerate perceived betrayal, and the extended prison sentences facing current defendants could motivate remaining members to send messages about the consequences of cooperation with law enforcement. The multi-state nature of Pagans' operations complicates ongoing investigations and enforcement efforts. Success in Missouri doesn't necessarily translate to reduced activity in neighboring states, where different chapters continue operating with their own leadership, resources, and territorial ambitions. The organization's federal structure allows it to absorb regional losses while maintaining overall operational capacity. Recent arrests and convictions have also provided law enforcement agencies with unprecedented insight into Pagans' operational methods, communication systems, and organizational structure. This intelligence could prove valuable in future investigations, but it also alerts remaining members to investigative techniques and surveillance methods that may require updating their security procedures. The broader Outlaw Motorcycle Club community watches these developments carefully, understanding that successful prosecutions of one organization can influence law enforcement approaches to similar groups. The Pagans case may serve as a template for future investigations into organized criminal violence within the biker subculture, blood, patches, and consequences. The Pagans Motorcycle Club transformed the simple concept of brotherhood into something far more sinister. A criminal enterprise where violence wasn't just accepted, but celebrated, where loyalty was measured in blood, and where rival club members became targets in an undeclared war across America's highways. Their story reveals how quickly motorcycle enthusiasm can evolve into organized brutality when the wrong culture takes root. What began as weekend rides and club gatherings became coordinated campaigns of terror featuring axes, loaded firearms, and tactical precision that impressed even federal investigators accustomed to sophisticated criminal organizations. The guilty pleas that echoed through Missouri courtrooms provided rare insight into a world that typically operates in shadows. Christopher McGowen, Arthur Reynolds, Brandon Hodge, and Jeremiah Hahn didn't just confess to individual crimes. They exposed a systematic approach to violence that turned smash on sight from club slang into operational doctrine. Their victims survived physical attacks, but they'll carry psychological scars forever. The knowledge that fellow human beings planned their deaths, stalked them across state lines, and celebrated their suffering represents trauma that extends far beyond broken bones and bullet wounds. These weren't random crimes. They were personal declarations of war. The weapons caches, communication records, and organizational documents seized during federal raids confirmed what prosecutors suspected. The Pagans had industrialized violence, creating corporate structures around criminal enterprise and reward systems that encouraged escalating brutality. They had transformed motorcycle patches into military decorations earned through bloodshed. Law enforcement's response sent its own message. Federal prosecutors didn't treat these as simple assault cases. They recognized organized criminal enterprise and responded with racketeering charges that will keep many defendants in prison for decades. The court's message was clear. Turning brotherhood into brutality carries consequences that extend far beyond club loyalty. But perhaps the most chilling aspect of this story isn't what happened, it's what continues happening. The Pagans organization didn't disappear when these members were arrested. New leadership emerges, new recruits join, and the culture that created these crimes continues spreading across America's highway system. The roar of motorcycle engines will always symbolize freedom for most riders. But for rival club members traveling through Pagans territory, that same sound now carries undertones of threat. A reminder that somewhere in the rumble of chrome and steel, predators still hunt among the brotherhood.